Texas. I am Charlie, your co-host with
Andre Antonescu outside of our nation's share capital, Washington, D.C.
a beautiful city indeed. Well, today Andre and I are going to talk about Bronze Age collapse. We're going to do a little intro, kind of the significance of Bronze Age in human history and society, and then we're going to talk about kind of the mysterious nature that led to Bronze Age collapse and why scholars are kind of talking about how it's unclear how the Bronze Age collapse occurred. We're going to talk about kind of the interconnectedness of, international, truly international kind of trade networks, at least in the Mediterranean basin, and cultural exchanges of the time. We'll talk about a few signs and symptoms, kind of how it occurred. It was a little bit of economic stability, political upheaval, some climate change, invasion by the so-called Sea Peoples, which will definitely be a very interesting discussion. And then also talking kind of about what the aftermath was and how the transition occurred into the Iron Age. And then we'll talk a little bit about modern theories, especially some that kind of debate like a gradual decline versus a sudden catastrophe sort of occurring. And then kind of what the legacy is overall is what we'll end with to try to connect it with international events. So it's
Sounds good. I'll let you take it away on this one.
Yeah, I'll just so it's interesting. Bronze Age society was an interesting time. At this time, there was a lot of societies and cultures existing. The Mycenaeans in modern Greece, the Hittites, and the Egyptians in, of course, modern Egypt. And they were kind of all trading with each other. And the reason we know this isn't necessarily just from kind of written documents, which we primarily have from Egypt, but actually we can trace different types of pottery and even tin, which is used in the production of bronze, to see how bronze was developed. Because there's only a couple sources of tin, a vital portion of bronze that are found. Some are like in the hills of Afghanistan. So there's a trade network going over there. And then there's also a theory that tin might have come from something called the Tin Isles, which is what we would call England, the British Isles. And there's also potentially some other tin mines throughout the Italian peninsula and various parts of um, the Mediterranean. And then on the other hand, regarding pottery, you can see different styles of pottery. Often cultures develop a specific handle, a specific design, a specific covering. And then you can see, well, who did they trade with? Who did the Mycenaeans trade with? Oh, we see these exact pieces of pottery in Egypt as well. So that kind of shows you kind of this huge international interconnected trade network that existed. Um, so what would you add anything to that trade network, Andre, or just kind of some thoughts on that?
It is actually pretty fascinating how far it is. At that point in history, you don't really think of people as being very interconnected. You usually think of these relatively isolated communities, not far from almost like a primitive status. But there were some pretty advanced civilizations, obviously in the Near East and thousands of years. Mesopotamia, obviously the Aegean area, but also east they said Afghanistan. It's yes, they actually did have developed trade networks. It didn't necessarily mean all these people um, directly interacting with people on the other end of the trade route. But
Hey, I would speak a little closer to the computer though, or to your microphone.
yeah, sorry, I was just saying that yeah, this trade is often done through a series of intermediaries on the route. So yeah, I guess like in Afghanistan, like the early Iranian civilizations there would have traded with, Persia. Well, I guess this is before Persia actually even started. So like even then they had like trade routes across the Iranian plateau, the Elamites, the Assyrians and Babylonians had their own thing going on. Then obviously went to the Hittites, Anatolia, the Mycenaeans, and Greece, and at that point the Minoan civilization was starting to decline already, but it was definitely a Island, I think Iberia, Spain, of course, yeah, Britain had like these metal bronze. So it just goes to show you it takes a lot of like cooperation and cross cultural interaction to actually produce uh, the
Yeah,
metal that.
it definitely takes a lot of like cultural connection and international trade and things like that. Um, it's interesting. You're absolutely right, and that definitely correlates with something that we should bring up a little bit later. But basically, it mimics the modern world in a unique way, in that you absolutely need a lot of cooperation for copper, tin, for the smelting process that kind of leads to the metallurgy of bronze. Um,
Is that
so
those metals, tin and copper, rarely exist in the same place. Like
yeah,
they,
exactly. Yeah,
which is why it took like long journey and trade to actually make this happen. But the fact that they were able to do it to that scale, that they could make this metal in abundance to the point where this age was known for that, that's pretty impressive if you think about it.
yeah. It is. It is. It's interesting, kind of, to see like the technological advancing. And I mean, the reason we call it the Bronze Age is because it is kind of a technological advancement whereby you can sort of see markers of technology advancing over time. And one of these markers is the use of bronze. It's like, this is why we're characterizing this age as the Bronze Age. Um, it's because kind of from the years 3,300 or so to like 12,000 or 1,200 BC, you kind of have this use of bronze. And like you said, you need to combine all these elements together. Um, Ironically, you mentioned that all these things don't occur naturally with each other, but like iron actually naturally occurs abundantly in one place, right? You just need the element iron. But the thing is with iron, which is a later age after the Bronze Age, probably another discussion entirely. The reason that didn't really start becoming used is because you need a higher temperature for that. So bronze, you need a lower temperature, and iron, you need a higher temperature.
Yeah,
Uh,
iron is it's actually probably one of the most abundant, types of elements on Earth. So it's like everywhere. It's like 6% of the Earth's crust or something like that has, is iron. So, but as you said, they didn't have the ability to generate high enough temperatures to actually smelt it into like a usable form until later. But although iron was still known to be kind of a brittle or early on until they were able to refine it and
right.
eventually steel and things like that during like the Roman era. But before the Bronze Age, there was also a little thing called the Copper Age. So it wasn't just like a transition from like stone to suddenly bronze. Like there was a gradual process of people kind of learning and figuring out what works. Yeah, the bronze was also, oh, sorry, the Copper Age, known as the Chalcolithic Age, I think. I don't know if you've heard of that term.
Yeah. Chalcolithic or
4,000.
Neolithic, right?
Yeah. They
Um,
kind of end of
right after the Neolithic age, which is kind of like the new Stone Age rather than the Paleolithic age.
the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic are the three divisions of the Stone Age, so to speak. And
Yeah.
complex. And
And that's where you would find, I mean, just to kind of give some context, in the Stone Age is when you would find Stonehenge, right? Stonehenge is like this amazing, prehistoric monument, and the reason we call it prehistoric is it's kind of pre-written language of these, Sarsens, standing stones that are in like Somerset, I think, England.
right. Yeah, and a lot of people mistakenly associate those with like they think that the Druids are the ones that built that, although that far predated, the Celtic Druids. They used the same site that was built by
Yeah,
some people, but for
it's
different
fair to
purposes.
say they're not the Druids that Julius Caesar describes in his conquest
Right.
of Gaul. Yeah, it's although they may have used it indeed. Um, it's quite interesting to kind of see that.
So, it was used for like as an astronomical calendar of sorts, I believe.
Well, that itself is another podcast as well. But
Get into that.
we'll just wrap up kind of just talking about the introduction, kind of this Bronze Age. It's characterized by use of bronze. There's, that we start seeing a lot of development of writing systems. The Bronze Age first kind of appears in Western Asia, kind of the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and then extends to Anatolia and Egypt. And you can see all these artifacts from all these different regions. But something that scholars frequently debate is this thing called the Late Bronze Age collapse that occurred around the year 1200 to 1150. 1177 is a year that's frequently used. There's a book that I recently read titled 1177, and it basically says that the Bronze Age collapse was this event that we generally associate with the end that kind of disrupts this international trade route. So basically, the reason everything is falling apart is because Mycenae falls apart. It's because the Hittites fall apart, and regions in Anatolia are falling apart. And basically, this international trade route is kind of not working as well.
So
And
it's basically a chain reaction of sorts, like,
right.
lead to unrest in a sort or another.
And it's interesting to note one of the main evidences of a late Bronze Age collapse is kind of this burning of cities, destruction of cities. There's a lot of evidence of destruction. Kind of these Indo-European languages are having a big, implosion of a sort. A lot of people say that the Luwian civilization, the city of Troy, famed for the Trojan War in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Troy is a site that is used as evidence for Bronze Age collapse, as are other cities, Miletus, Hattusis, Morisson. It's very interesting, but Troy, it definitely gets a lot of attention as perhaps, was this perhaps a conglomeration of Greek Confederate city-states, Aegean ancient Greek civilization that later is, translated into or conveyed, using the oral tradition to antiquity, classical antiquity. But a lot of this evidence, and Troy was kind of on the western part of the Hittite Empire near Mycenaean Greece, and Miletus is down the coast of the Aegean Sea in western Anatolia. So there's some ideas that these sea peoples might have been part of these invasions. Now, sea peoples, the reason we call them the sea peoples is because there's some famous depictions of the sea peoples and their battles with the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptians were one of the peoples who didn't completely suffer during Bronze Age collapse. And basically, there's this big depiction of Ramses III at this huge battle of the Delta, which occurs around 1175, which is a major invasion of people by sea. And there's kind of a big depiction of Ramses as like a bow and arrow with tons of soldiers fighting these people who are invading the Nile Delta. So
Right.
if not, oh yeah, you guys.
That was the picture where they had the horned helmets, right? Right,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
like
exactly.
pre-Viking, like they did it first.
It's interesting, and then the horned helmet is used by some ethnographers and historians and anthropologists as evidence of maybe like, okay, so what cultures, like what we were talking earlier with pottery, what cultures were using these horned helmets, and then maybe we can trace it back to them. But if you kind of look at this picture, it looks like there's multiple different groups. It's not just horned helmet people. They have different helmets, they have different footwear and all this stuff. So it kind of indicates, a lot of people use that as evidence to say, okay, it wasn't just one group of people. There was actually multiple groups of people, like some sort of confederation that would come down and invade Egypt. And we have records from Egypt, like we said, because the invasion ultimately was unsuccessful, or they were able to broker some sort of peace. And it's interesting to use that as evidence. So you kind of use that depiction of the sea peoples from the New Kingdom of Egypt under Ramses III to try to figure out, well, like, what who were these people and why were they the causes of Bronze Age collapse? Um, so that's just other evidence. We see evidence of destruction in Anatolia. We see evidence of destruction in Cyprus. In Greece, basically there was kind of this interesting Bronze Age civilization. Mycenaeans, you can talk about linear B script, linear A. Maybe we should focus a little bit on that. But after this, we go into the Greek Dark Ages. And basically, we don't hear much about the Greeks, anything really going on from Mycenaean civilization to kind of the Archaic Age starting in 750. So from like 1100 BC, 1100 BC to 750, you don't really hear much of what's going on in Greece, and it's because of this kind of Bronze Age collapse. There is actually some evidence that there were Cyclopean, named after the Cyclops, the one-eyed individual, fortifications on the Acropolis of Athens, but maybe just like the region of Athens was sort of surviving in this kind of like sea of a dark age, and it's basically these big boulders in on the Acropolis, and it's generally associated with Mycenaean like architecture, kind of this big lion's gate in Mycenae, Greece.
Yeah,
Yeah, let me take a sip of water.
actually, so yeah, think about like the Dark Ages though, because it's interesting. A lot of times, the Dark Ages, there's the term hides a lot underneath the surface of that term. People assume it's just like a completely, like an age of backwardness and ignorance, and we just don't have a lot of records for it. Basically, is the thing. And the same thing applies to the European Dark Ages after the fall of Rome. Not necessarily as bad as people think. But yeah, there was a breakdown in written tradition, right? And this was the era that Homer supposedly concocted the Iliad and Odyssey, but it wasn't really written down until much later, passed on purely orally. But I'm thinking, I think from my understanding, like this era had a lot of developments in like this is like the Iron Age. So like there were developments in metallurgy and like in, the early foliage kind of started up, and like it wasn't, not everything was quite lost. I think a lot of that was because of influence from like the east, like in Mesopotamia, kind of like regenerated more complex, you know, forms of social and political organization in Greece and the Aegean. But but yeah, no. Far back as no, so like the thing about the Mycenaeans, both the Mycenaeans and the Minoans belong to the Bronze Age. Minoans were the first civilization on the island of Crete and extended of the surrounding islands. As they declined, partly because of, I think, an explosion of a volcano, like an eruption, the Mycenaeans came in to dominate. They're the ones who had the Indo-European language, and I think it was linear A, right?
Yep. Linear A has not been deciphered yet, but linear B has been deciphered, and there's been
Right.
fragments found. Yeah.
Is basically a very ancient form of Hellenic, which is Indo-European. Well, the Minoan was not; it was its own kind of thing.
Yeah. Before the
That about what you said for Troy, though, like Troy, I think was known as Wilusa in some of the texts and in some of the Hittite texts, and it's not sure if they were a branch of Hittites or of Luwians or other Anatolian Indo-European like speakers in that part of it of Anatolia. I never heard that they were actually Greek themselves, though. That
Well, I mean, there's a lot we could unpack over there. I mean, certainly, kind of this whole question about language. I mean, ultimately, it wasn't transmitted through a written medium primarily. It was transmitted through kind of just oral composition. And I mean, indeed, Homer's Iliad, there's this age old question, was Homer one individual or multiple individuals? And kind of there's been this huge tradition of doing investigations or anthropological and linguistic analysis of oral traditions going back thousands of years. In the 1920s, actually, some American professors of Latin and Greek went over to study Yugoslavia, where there were still living individuals who did traditional orally recorded, or they recorded oral. They recorded their poetry like orally because they were illiterate basically, and it was a very beautiful thing. Unfortunately, well, I mean it's fortunate and unfortunate when literacy comes over to a society, you basically lose this oral tradition because the way things are recorded is on the medium of paper and writing. And
Yeah.
interesting, that was Milman Perry and his group. He was a classicist who studied Homeric studies, and he's considered like the Darwin of Homeric studies. And he found that the meter and the structure of how those in Yugoslavia in the 1920s, basically 100 years ago, maybe less than 100 years ago, um, did their oral tradition is exactly the same as Homer was doing it 3,000 years ago. So, I mean, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, no, that really is like I'm not sure if it was it the actual Iliad and Odyssey, or is it just like their own stories and poetry in that style in that oral tradition?
Oh no, no, no! I don't think it was the Iliad and the Odyssey. It was their own like poetry in the style of that, but they had kind of like the pattern, like bright-eyed Athena, and you'd have these other markers of memorizing which pattern was next. You'd be like Xanthus Menelaus, like blonde or redheaded Menelaus, or the rosy-fingered Dawn, or the wine-dark sea, kind of like that. So you kind of get a lot of repetitiveness in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So, and they evidently that is found in all Indo-European texts, going back to India. The
Yeah,
Mahabharata and the
they,
Bhagavad Gita use the same patterns, and it's just interesting. I mean, you could think of poetic tradition. You could say, well, where does T.S. Eliot get his influence from? Well, he gets it from Shakespeare, or partly from Shakespeare, right? And Chaucer. And where did they get it from? Shakespeare is a little bit influenced by Edmund Spenser, or by yeah, partly probably Edmund Spenser, the Fairy Queen, and John Milton, and then they're influenced by Canterbury Tales, and then who's in Canterbury Tales influenced by Homer, the Aeneid, and the Troubadours, and then ultimately the question becomes who was Homer influenced by, because we don't really have more than that. Well, maybe Gilgamesh, but that isn't really Indo-European, but it's really these linguistic patterns, and it's not like Greece had trade or direct contact with India that wrote the Bhagavad Gita. It's that these linguistic patterns existed in Indo-European
yeah,
languages.
and they were kind of they showed up in all these very geographically disparate places where their kind of linguistic descendants, live, which is pretty fascinating, kind of tying it all together.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but anyway, so back to the Trojan War. Like, so the Trojan War, in some form, probably did happen. Like, obviously, maybe not quite the extent of like the story, but some kind of conflict. I think from Heinrich Schliemann's excavations there in the late 19th century, they were able to develop several. They were able to discover several layers of Troy. I think this is like Troy 6 was the one that they thought was actually like violently burned down and attacked during the war. They correlate that to the invasion of the UK and Akiyawa.
It's funny. Where Homer says Troy was, where Thucydides and just say Troy was exactly where Troy was, near the
Yeah,
Dardanelles. Um, and what's funny? Yeah, you're right. Heinrich Schliemann, he excavated Troy and found it. But the idea is now that I believe a lot of scholars think that there were multiple layers, like you said, multiple layers. But they also think that means multiple invasions of Troy. So maybe it just wasn't one invasion.
yeah. Definitely that's definitely possible. There could have been natural, disasters and reasons for why they rebuilt like a layer, but I mean, there's a lot more work there to be done. And unfortunately, from what I understand, like, uh, they were not like Heinrich's expedition at the time was not very careful, and they actually caused a lot of like collateral kind of damage to the site, and like some things are irrevocably kind of lost. So it kind of goes to show you now we have more professional, careful archaeologists. But back then, it was still kind of like a new thing, and unfortunately,
Definitely have messed up a lot of stuff. But I mean, it's yeah, it kind of. I mean, what can you do? What's happened sort of happened. It's sad. Um, and but it is interesting to use kind of the Iliad and the Trojan War as evidence of these sea peoples or types of invasions that led to Bronze Age collapse. Kind of bringing it back to the topic of this, and you know, a lot of areas didn't survive, like Anatolia, Cyprus, Syria, southern Levant didn't survive, but areas that did survive were like Mesopotamia, kind of the Assyrian Empire. Um, and then Egypt, of course, survived a lot, and that's where we have a lot of evidence from the reigns, the reigns of Ramses III, and how he in Medinet Habu is kind of where that massive depiction is. In that, it's a relief from the mortuary at Medinet Habu, which is a really beautiful complex. I'd love to go there someday.
That's
And
right. Egypt, it wasn't the end of Egypt, but that was kind of like the end of their glory days. That was during the New Kingdom. That was after the reign of Ramses the second, which was like in the previous century. But after that, they wasn't. They kind of went downhill. So like in a way, they still got affected by it. Maybe not wiped out like like the Hittites and completely collapsed like them, or like the Mycenaeans, but it did a number on them too.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it age is a fascinating. I agree with you. It's a fascinating time period because you kind of have like you have Thebes, Thebes in Egypt. You have Akhenaten. Uh, oh, sorry. What were you saying?
Oh, I wasn't saying anything. I was just no, I was
Oh,
just saying.
no. I mean, the New Kingdom was fascinating, and it kind of collapses after this. It's one of the golden ages of Egypt, and it was a fantastic time period.
Let's just think that we're already like thousands of years old at this point.
Oh yeah, I mean the pyramids already been there for at least 1,000 years, and they were just kind of living over there. And a lot of the evidence that we have for the Bible as well, kind of occurring around this time. The Canaanites are revolting in like Ashkelon and Yanoam in Israel, and
I've heard,
so the evidence of the Canaanites that are brought up in the Bible are also kind of existing around this time period simultaneously.
yeah, I've
Uh,
heard some interesting theories about like Exodus. Like some people say that there's no. This is kind of controversial, but that there's not that much evidence for Israelites having been in Egypt, and then rather it was Egypt that conquered them, and they gained independence from Egypt in their own land, as opposed to wandering through the desert. But obviously, that's subject to a lot of debate, interpretation. But
I mean, we
still,
should do another podcast on that. As I know you and I have discussed off podcast before that. Freud, in his last book, had suggested that Moses was a priest of Akhenaten, who was one of the people during the reign of the New Age Empire, or the New Kingdom in Egypt. And Moses, through him, it was a priest of this first recorded individual in history, Akhenaten, who was in the New Kingdom of Egypt, and he proclaimed monotheism. It's the first recorded instance in history of monotheism. It was sort of everyone worships the pharaoh, and then who's Akhenaten, and then Akhenaten is the only one who's allowed to worship the Aken. That is the only god. It's an interesting history. There isn't a lot of evidence kind of at that time period when Freud was writing. I think he published it when he was 83 years old. Um, he sort of suggested that that's kind of the origins of Judaism, of course, is the origins of Christianity. Um, yeah, yeah. Another podcast. Another thing is I wanted to bring up, kind of moving on to another topic, is that there's a number of causes, not just political, that may have caused this upheaval in Bronze Age collapse, and a lot of them are considered environmental. There were a lot of volcanoes that had erupted. There was a famous volcanic eruption in the 1150s in Iceland that is considered to lead to famine because it created a volcanic winter. And there's kind of like geographic evidence for a volcanic winter where global temperatures had gone down. There's evidence of like large migrations of people, perhaps causing these sea peoples to move due to droughts in the region, because it's considered Also, geographically, we've been able to show like there's drought indexes um, for various locations throughout Greece and modern Turkey, which would have been Anatolia back then.
Yeah.
Um, and there's also evidence that kind of suggests, well, was there a plague going on as well? There might have been like an extinct, a strain we wouldn't really be able to study now, the bubonic plague, that also caused the sea peoples to move. So you might see like all this breakdown in international relations. It might have been caused by a huge volcanic eruption in Iceland, which might have also caused a huge drought, which might have also caused, there might have been a pandemic because of the famine being caused by the drought and the volcanic, winter. Um, and might have just been general system collapses that might have occurred, just because, if you have all these things kind of going on at once, then like the political structure just can't handle it. And, society is kind of unable to handle these things. And if I could end on like a conclusion that I got from this book was basically uh, there isn't one theory of why Bronze Age society collapsed. It was the best theory we have so far is that all these things were happening at once. We had like the invasions that might have been exacerbated by the environmental issues, volcanoes, drought, and then that leads to the political upheaval. That leads to the Sea Peoples going south and fighting the Egyptians. So really, Bronze Age
Yeah.
may have just been a whole lot of things going badly at once.
It's much more complicated than people might think, because like the sea peoples were like an amalgam of people from the Western Mediterranean, Sardinia, to Sicily, Italy, the leftover Greeks from the Mycenaeans that collapsed, along with like possibly Philistines, all these theories. But like these environmental issues, economic, political upheaval all kind of came together, this perfect storm that kind of caused this chain reaction, kind of bring it down. So they still don't know how to, the identity of the people is not like set in stone. There's still a lot of things to say about it, but it's still like a very fascinating time, and I hope we find out more about it. As because there's still more digs, there's more archaeological sites to kind of
Yeah,
explore. But
never goes under the sea. Every once in a while, you discover shipwrecks with tons of pottery, really nicely preserved. Sometimes you just find new evidence. I mean, the Rosetta Stone was found during the Napoleonic era, and that was really big. Imagine if we found like a Rosetta Stone for Linear A.
yeah, yeah, who knows? Someday we might be able to finally decipher it. But
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. Being said, it may not be the most interesting thing in the world, but it might just give us an insight to how people kind of lived back then. And I mean, then you might ask, well, why is that relevant? And I would say it's absolutely relevant because all this stuff we discussed is kind of the world we live in today. We got tons of environmental issues, we got tons of political issues, and it goes to show maybe our systems are stronger. So maybe if we had a number of environmental catastrophes, we'd be okay. But like, it goes to show like if things start adding up, then there's no guarantee that society is going to keep on increasing and like going in this one way trajectory towards progress that we generally assume.
very true, because as we've seen, history has been a series of progressions and then setbacks, and then it's cyclical, and we assume that we're on this like constant path of progress, so to speak. But like we don't know that, and that's a scary thing. We're very self assured, right now, in the same way that I'm sure the Egyptians of 1200 BC or the Romans of like 100 AD were. But you know, the world's gonna be a crazy place.
It's a crazy place, and it just to go. I hope this just goes to show that studying history and like especially even and history beyond antiquity, like even all the way to prehistory, is really relevant to our own day. Can learn a lot of lessons. It's not just curious, but the more curiosity you put into it, the more it gives to you. So I
That's
don't know.
right. It's very important to uphold the fire of learning. As cheesy as that sounds, like knowledge is what leads people through these
Yeah,
so-called dark ages, helps things come back, rise from the ashes again. Or prevents falling into it in the first place. So a cautionary tale, I guess.
yeah. Well, maybe we should end on that note.
Yeah, for sure. Hope you guys enjoyed this different episode of the Charlie Andre podcast. Any final words, Charlie?
History is interesting, relevant, and it can always be uncovering new things about yourself, about society, and about what happened back then. So stay tuned for the next episode.